Hello there, it's Tom here, and this is Chapter 38 of Gunnerkrigg Court, Divine. Now, this chapter was pretty fun for a couple of reasons. The first being that it mainly features Zimmy, and Zimmy is always fun to draw and write, because she's pretty different from a lot of the other characters. And when she's the focus, the other reason I enjoyed this chapter is because I can use her to play around with the format of how I'm conveying the story. And in this chapter I wanted to kind of tell it in a very disjointed way that hopefully ties together towards the end, while not answering all the questions, because here I was setting up something that would be revealed much later on in the story. And aside from setting up a future scenario, another thing that this chapter serves as is almost like a look back at some of the previous chapters, and I'll mention that when we get to those sections. We kind of start out with Zimmy trying to run away from something, showing that she's kind of disturbed, and Gamma telling her that she needs to help out, which throws us into the situation here where we don't really know what is going on. We just see that Annie is in a hospital bed and Kat is looking a bit worse for wear next to her. And you might notice in these panels that I have a very subtle color overlay, and I did this because, spoiler alert, what is going on here is not actually happening in the real world. And so right from the start I wanted to give off a hint that something is not quite right. And right from the get-go I can start to play around with some of the effects that Zimmy has on the world around her. Here, for example, Zimmy is able to essentially read Kat's mind in kind of a weird way. And a lot of the things I enjoy when planning stories with Zimmy, and one of the reasons why I'd like to work on a comic mainly featuring Zimmy and Gamma themselves, is that the way that Zimmy affects the world around her is not particularly in her control, but there is some kind of twisted logical consistency in the way that the world is warped around her. And this chapter is kind of a small look into the way that Zimmy lives her life. I've talked before about how Zimmy is perhaps sensitive to the ether in the same way that Coyote or Annie is. But here we can see that the line between reality and the ether is very much blurred for Zimmy, and that's where a lot of her problems arise. And in this example, we can see that Zimmy is almost calling on these problems that she has to help her with the situation. Because even Kat's aware that when Gamma leaves Zimmy's side, that things are liable to go kind of weird. And when we jump into the sequence with Zimmy essentially looking into Annie's mind, it's kind of reminiscent of scenes in the past where Annie has been delving into the ether, but I wanted to make the experience kind of unique for Zimmy. A lot of the stuff she sees during this is symbolic of actual things that have happened or sentiments and stuff. And here I was playing around with trying to show how Zimmy interprets these symbols and images so that she gets an understanding of what the situation is. Previously in the story, Zimmy is shown as somebody who's very out of control and barely hanging on and kind of desperate, but here I wanted to show that she's intentionally letting herself lose a bit of control and using that and the experience that she's gained in her life to help somebody that has helped her in the past. Oh, and here is a glimpse of a character that Annie met in the forest, this green guy Camlin here, and you can read about Annie's exploits in the forest in the two short stories that are on the extra comic section of my site, Annie in the Forest Part 1 and Part 2, which can be read here. So, now that Zimmy is taking a look in Annie's mind, we're kind of getting a few glimpses back into scenarios that have happened in the past, and that we, the reader, have seen in the comic previously, like the scene here from Chapter 6 where Annie and Kat are sitting below the tree, and Zimmy's taking the place of the shadowy figure. And Zimmy also learns very quickly about Annie copying Kat's homework, and poking around allows her to start to figure out what the problem is with Annie. Here's Zimmy delving much deeper into Annie's psyche than perhaps even Annie is aware of, and seeing that there is something fundamentally wrong at a base level. And we can see here, visually represented, Zimmy is able to figure out that whatever it is that is affecting Annie is possibly something to do with her dad. And for those who are up to date in the comic, they'll know that this is very directly setting up something that is recalled later in the story. And I kind of enjoyed setting up this scenario, which by the end of this chapter didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. And people were questioning what was going on, and despite the situation being resolved, not really knowing what the deal was. And I sort of enjoyed leaving that hanging there and then tying it all back in later on in a way that wasn't quite expected. Because this brought together a lot of the elements that had been set up much earlier in the story. And it's pretty fun to bring back elements that I've had planned from a long time ago and then actually using them in the story itself. And just on a visual side, because a lot of this is reminiscent of taking place in the ether, that does allow me to do sort of pages that don't follow any normal paneling structure, and I can do big illustrative pictures of Zimmy like in this panel, or playing around with the paneling itself. For example, here when we take another flashback to the power station chapter when Annie was hanging around with Jack, I can mess around with the background and go back to old color schemes that evoke memories of chapters in the past. And it's always really fun to be able to do stuff like that in the story. And so here, after Zimmy has helped Annie out a little bit. She sort of gets flung back out of Annie's mind and is really freaked out by Kat. And if you remember at the beginning of this chapter, Zimmy was really apprehensive of coming out and helping Annie. And we would assume that it was because she didn't want to see Annie, but it turns out that she was apprehensive of coming here because she's outright terrified of Kat. And we get a view here of something else that I bring back later in the story, which is that things look very different depending on who is looking at them. Like on this page here, we get a glimpse of how Kat appears to Zimmy. And this page in particular, I had a great time working on it. It was, I had a very definite idea in mind, and I think I came fairly close. The idea I had was an image of something that is not really an object you could see standing in a room. I kind of like the idea of something existing only in like a bas relief, where the foreground and background is part of a single entity and image here. And I mean, I tried to capture that here by extending the image completely outside of the bounds of the canvas here, but also leveling in the background with very shallow shadows and tying them into the figure in the foreground. I was basically trying to capture something which could not really be perceived in a 3D space, and I think this is about as close as I could have gotten to it. And I chose to display this page with no build-up because I wanted it to be very shocking and just out of left field. And I remember at the time the readers being pretty surprised and excited by it, so I think I was able to convey what I was hoping. But we come back to the main characters again, and here we see that as they fade away, Kat wakes up, and we're back in a scene that doesn't have that colour overlay over it, and we can see now that she's back in the real world, and Annie seems okay. And in fact, Kat has no real memory of what just happened. And we end off again here, sort of as I described before. Both Zimmy and Gamma are kind of outside the bounds of what this real world is. They're almost like observers who have left the scene behind them, and they're almost walking away outside of the comic into whatever realm it is that they exist in, then bookending the chapter with a scene that is mirrored in the first few pages. And this bonus page, who knows? And that's that. Come back again for chapter 39, The Great Secret.